Is the gap between rich and poor widening? The incomes of top earners have risen much faster than for everyone else. This trend has been particularly marked in Australia, Denmark, Finland, the UK, Mexico, and the United States. In a few countries, France, Portugal, and Spain, the gap between rich and poor has stayed the same. The richest people in OECD countries have an income about 9 times more than the poorest. This ratio is 6 to 1 in Norway and Denmark, 10 to 1 in Italy, Japan, Korea, and the UK, 14 to 1 in Turkey, Israel, and the US, and reaches 27 to 1 in Mexico and Chile. The most common way to measure inequality is via the Gini coefficient, where 0 means everyone has the same income, and 1 means the richest person has all the income. Over the past 2 decades, it rose in 17 of the 22 countries for which there are data. It increased in the US, Finland, Germany, and Sweden. It fell in Mexico and Turkey, but from very high levels. The picture is very different in the big emerging economies, with inequality much higher than in most of the OECD. But the trends show wide differences between countries. At one extreme, strong growth during the past decade went hand in hand with declining income inequality in Brazil and Indonesia. At the other extreme, China and India have seen steep rises, even though their economies were also growing fast. Income inequality also increased in Russia and South Africa, and Argentina is the only country where inequality has changed little. The 1990s and 2000s saw a surge in the share of people reporting extremely high incomes. This was particularly the case in the US, Canada, Ireland, and Finland. Top income tax rates fell from around 60 to 70% 20 years ago to around 40% today. More people work part-time these days. Earnings inequality in Finland, the Netherlands, and Germany is low among full-time workers, but jumps dramatically when you include part-time employees and the self-employed. In other countries like Israel, Canada, and the US, the difference is less marked. On the other hand, the fact that more women are working has softened the rise in earnings inequality.
Good afternoon, good evening, I guess I should say, and welcome to the session on why has growth become so inequitable. And as the Women's Forum is not only about identifying problems and asking questions, but also about finding solutions, there will be a second part to this title and to this session, what to do about it. My name is Sylvie Kaufmann. I'm the editorial director of the French newspaper Le Monde, and I will be moderating this session with this wonderful Madonna set, which doesn't make me feel as Madonna at all, but maybe it will get better. For the past 2 days, we have looked at many aspects of growth, including 360 degrees. We have looked at how to achieve it, why it has stalled in some parts of the world, why it has taken off in other parts of the world, how to measure it, where is it, what can women do to foster it. We've even talked about degrowth, and asked whether we really need growth. But since we're still in a world where growth and economic growth remains the main standard until we change it, there is there is a component of growth in this globalized age that no one apparently can escape, maybe a few, as we saw on this movie, there are very, very few exceptions, which is inequality. Inequality is rising everywhere. We've had the 99% movement in the US and in other parts of the West. We see the gap also widening in emerging countries, where the rich are becoming very, very, very rich. So why is it so, and is it inevitable? To answer these questions and solve these issues, and I'm sure that by the end of this session we'll have found the right answers, we have a very, very qualified panel, and I will invite you to take part in this discussion immediately, as soon as you want, as we start discussing, thanks to the Wisembly system that I'm sure many of you have already tried in the previous sessions. So you can ask your questions, and we will follow your reactions. You just send your questions to following the instructions, which will be on the screen, and we will take them later on in the discussion. So we have first on the right, Laurent Freix. We've discussed the different ways of pronouncing it. He is the Executive Vice President and Zone Director for Europe at Nestlé. He's French. He joined Nestlé in 1986, which is almost 25 years ago, so he's really a Nestlé boy, un homme de Nestlé. He has held various positions in sales and marketing. Then he joined the nutrition division. After that, he was head of, or CEO, I guess you say, of Nestlé Hungary. Then CEO of Nestlé, of the Iberian region for Nestlé, which I guess is Spain and Portugal, yes. And in 2008, he joined Nestlé's executive board, and he's the executive vice president. How many women do you have on the executive board?
Shame on us, we got one.
Okay.
It's work in progress. We got 3 in the board of directors.
Okay. So
out of 12.
Yeah.
But I can continue.
No, you'll do better. I'm sure when you come back next year, there will be more. And he today leads the Nestlé Nutrition, Health and Wellness Mission, which we'll talk about later. Then we have, sorry, we are not in the right order, Sarah Bloom-Raskin. Sarah Bloom-Raskin is from America. She's also a banker, but a different kind. She's a central banker. Since she's a member of the board of governors at the Fed. Prior to this, she was the commissioner of financial regulation for the state of Maryland. It sounds complicated, but her job was just a very challenging one, since it was during the financial crisis, and which means she had to lead Maryland through all this process of reforms, legislation, regulation, foreclosure process that the crisis made necessary. And Sarah Bloom has also served as a banking counsel for the US Senate Banking Committee. Danuta Hubner is from Poland, and she's a true European. I think we can say that. In 2004, when Poland joined the EU, she became European Commissioner for Regional Policy, a position she held for 5 years. Before that, Danuta Hubner held various cabinet positions in post-communist governments of Poland, including Minister for European Affairs. And today, Professor Hübner is a very active member of the European Parliament, where she chairs, among other things, she chairs the Committee on Regional Development. And finally, we have Anthony Jenkins, who is the Chief Executive of Barclays. It's a recent appointment. In August this year, you took this position in rather dramatic circumstances, if I may say so. He Anthony Jenkins was Chief Executive of Retail and Barclays Banking, and he joined the Barclays Executive Committee in 2009. How many women?
3. 3 out of 9.
Oh, that's...
2 out of 5 business unit leaders are women.
That's good. That's not bad. That's not bad. Yeah, it's not bad. Before that, you had been the chief executive of Barclaycard, which was a very successful, which you made very successful unit. And this experience makes you a banker who knows what real life is, I think, is about. And if I may, this is very much what the financial world needs in this troubled time. So I will start with you. You are also on the front line of this crisis, and you have witnessed over the past few years its impact and the different way how it has impacted at people, and so you have seen inequality rising. Can you tell us, I know this is a very general and difficult question, but we need to address it. Why is inequality rising, in your view? And do you think it was inevitable?
So, the world we live in is very...
Sorry, is this me? I don't know.
The world we live in is a difficult and challenging place today. And the question of inequality is indeed a serious and profound one. There is one point I would like to make before I address the question, though, and that is, if you look at the absolute level of living standards in the world, they have improved quite significantly over the last 30 years. For example, 1 billion people lifted out of poverty in India and China. Generally speaking, living standards in the developed world have increased quite significantly. So absolute living standards have increased, and that's a positive in this debate. However, I think there are some very, very significant changes going on in the economies of the world. We tend to focus on the developing world and what's happening there. But if you look at the last 30 years, 2 very significant things have happened in the developed world. The first thing is the growth of technology. And technology moving out of the sort of mainframe to PC, then the web, cloud, etc., has created an enormous amount of wealth and exacerbated, in my view, income inequality. It has also created second-order effects where, because of the capability of technology, you're able to see industries like financial services grow very, very fast indeed, because technology empowered that.
So it's the have and the have-nots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the other end, so that's the top end. But the other end, in my view, is the most concerning. And if I look at youth unemployment around the world, it is very, very difficult. Places where we do business, the United States, Europe, South Africa, very high levels of youth unemployment. And that is not solely linked to where we are in the economic cycle. In the UK, we use a definition which we call NEETs. This is young people who are not in education, employment, or training. There are today in the UK about 1 million people in this category, but in 2004, there were 800,000 people in this category. So something structural has happened to the nature of the UK economy. What is that? What's happened is that the old manual jobs in manufacturing and other areas no longer exist in economies like the United Kingdom. On my way to the airport this morning, I drove through the Docklands, which is now, of course, the Canary Wharf financial area where the Olympics was and so on. 40 years ago, that was full of people offloading goods from ships. That's all done in containerized ports now. And so this exit of kind of manual work offshore is part of what's driving this. One of the things that we've done in the UK is to create apprenticeships for people in this category of NEETs, and we've done 1,000 of them. McDonald's has done about 3,000, and talking with the people from McDonald's, they have exactly the same issue that we have, which is if you want to work in a McDonald's or you want to work in a Barclays Bank, you have to have basic levels of literacy and numeracy. 30 years ago, you didn't need those skills because you left and went into a manual-based occupation. Those jobs are gone. And so if you look at the structural changes in the economy, in the developed world in particular, I think that's what's driving a lot of this. Now, as the film showed, clearly similarly positioned economies in the developed world have had different outcomes. So it's not solely these trends, but I think they are powerful drivers. And perhaps when we come on to talk about what we can do about it, for me, one of the key issues is how do we upskill young people so that they can be productive members of society and contribute economic value in this new economy. And that is, of course, partly the responsibility of the education system, but I also think it's partly the responsibility also of business.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're welcome to answer each other. And
I think that does it work? Yeah. There are, of course, many factors, but I think that those that you mentioned are extremely important. But I also think that when European companies try to compete also with the growing competition coming from China, India, or I think increasingly also Africa, they also tend to give to young people especially very strange contracts, just half a year, 1 year without social security. I was recruiting my assistants a couple of years ago, and I just read CV of people with 3-4 languages, and it's incredible. They spend half a year in this company, half a year in another company, without really having the long-term assurance that they will continue to work, without having the social security taken care of. So I think that also in many European companies, because we don't have a regulation on this, you can have this type of employment, which is, of course, reducing the costs, but it's also, I think, giving people jobs that are extremely low, and that also increases, I think, the disparities of people in their 20s, 30s. They continue to be employed in such a way that it keeps the costs low, but also they increase the disparities, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So I think there is an element of that without doubt, but one of the other issues, of course, is supply-side labour market rigidities, which are also not helpful in this regard, because in certain countries it's incredibly difficult to exit poor performers, for example, and that clogs up the system for talented young people coming through. So there is no, of course, one silver bullet to all these problems, but I think it's a very valid point. And certainly what we've tried to do as an employer with these apprenticeship schemes is make sure that not only are people paid to do the work and paid at the market rate, but also that they get training in the course of it, and where possible, they'll end up being full-time employees of us. So.
Sarah Bloom-Raskin, you, as I said, you came from America. You actually came specially for this forum from America, which is great. And you left the country where the presidential campaign is in full swing. And one of the issues which have been very much discussed in this campaign is the role of government. I'm not asking you to take side here, though you're welcome if you want. But when it comes to inequality and to fighting inequality, whose job is it to fight to reverse this trend? Is it the government's job? What is your view about this?
Well, thank you very much for that. And I do want, before I answer that question, to just sort of weigh in on the number of women who are members of the Federal Reserve Board. We have it's a board of 6 with a chairman, and 3 are women.
Wow,
so,
that's really
wanted to bring that up. The income inequalities and wealth inequalities that we're seeing in the U.S. are really quite distressing. And I want to say a couple of things about them by way of a preface. I want to say something about income inequality in the U.S., wealth inequality in the U.S., and what these inequalities mean for policymakers, for government, what it is that government can do, should do, and needs to pay attention when it does do. So, first of all, I want to say something about sort of the traditional view in America, and this is a view that is now, I think, under some significant attack. But traditionally, and before the crisis, there was a view that income and wealth inequalities could be tolerated for a bit. If they didn't create huge disparities, then maybe they weren't that harmful, that in essence they provided, as long as there was mobility, they would provide room for aspiration and room for growth. And essentially this view, I would say, was a dominant view in the U.S. Until we got hit with a significant financial crisis. And this financial crisis and the recession that followed and the slow recovery that we're now in, I would say, has significantly altered the public's view of what income inequality and wealth inequality might mean. I want to say at the outset that there are some people who view this sort of the poor distribution of wealth and income as contributing, in fact, to the crisis, as making the crisis worse than it would have been otherwise. Some people view the wealth inequalities as primarily contributing to financial instability, and financial instability playing a role in the financial crisis. Here are some of the facts, and I know you saw the film, but I want to focus in a little bit on what is happening in the U.S. so that you can have these numbers in front of you. Now, since 1980 in the U.S., income has increasingly accrued to the top half percentile. One component of this income inequality really stems from wages. So if you look at a spectrum, say you look at the bottom percentile, you look at the median, and you look at the top percentile, what we're seeing in the U.S. is a fairly steady gap existing between the lowest percentile and the median, but a growing and widening disparity that exists and is growing between the median percentile and wages at the top. Now, I want to insert one caveat here in terms of why measurements in the U.S. may be somewhat misleading, and that is, as many of you know, health insurance is a form of, comes through jobs, comes through a person's participation in a workplace. And if you look at compensation differentials, they're slightly showing a little bit better in terms of gaps than income inequality. But still the gaps are there. Now, if you look at wealth inequality in the U.S., we see even more concentration. So since 2007, the top 1% of households by wealth held 33% of our country's wealth. If you look at the top 10% of households by wealth, you'll see them holding 71% of our country's wealth. And if you look at the bottom 50% of households by wealth in the U.S., you will see them holding 2.5% of the country's wealth. So wealth is really showing a trend towards concentration, and this trend has been continuing in the U.S. since 1989. Well, then the recession comes, the recession hits, and we ask ourselves, well, what did this do? What did this do to these disparities in the U.S.? Well, the recession hit, the crisis hit, and it was a fairly broad-based hit, but it did hurt disproportionately individuals with lower skills, people who were dependent on housing, and it created, this recession in particular in the U.S. has created large pools of individuals who are long-term unemployed. Okay, these are individuals who want to be working and have not been able to find jobs for 6 months or longer. This unemployment of this long-term unemployment is really far higher than the U.S. has seen in any of its post-recession periods. Why is it concerning? Well, from the perspective of income and wealth disparities, it's very disturbing because obviously if you don't have a job, you don't have income. If you don't have income, you are subject to a host of issues. First of all, if you don't have a job, by the way, you don't have health insurance. You have a higher incidence of stress-related health problems. We're finding now evidence of children in homes where there are unemployed parents by choice that school achievement is actually less. There are lower long-term earnings potential associated with children in these households. So you can see the effect of, when you look at this next generation of children, how this notion, this assumption of economic mobility and equality of opportunity really becomes eroded. I do want to say, in direct answer to the question about government, the role of government, we think traditionally, of fiscal policy, as fiscal policy being the tool by which redistribution could occur. Fiscal policy in the U.S. is engaged in by the Congress. The other main tool of economic growth is monetary policy, and that tool is used essentially by the Fed, by the Federal Reserve Board. That tool of monetary policy is really not as good a tool for redistribution purposes as would be tools of taxation, tools of investment, tools of private-public partnerships. Those kinds of tools are really the realm of Congress, of fiscal policy. But in the absence of those tools, monetary policy, the Fed still has a mandate. That mandate is to maximize employment in the context of price stability. And so we must act. And when we do act, we want to be cognizant of the effects that our policy choices have on distributions, on income distributions and wealth distributions. And as I said, these tools that monetary policy uses are far from perfectly effective. They're really actually quite crude. But the point is that they do have effects on this tableau of distribution, and I think they need to be used very carefully in order to not do anything that would have an adverse effect on what exists. Now, the tools that monetary policy typically engages in affect assets, affect holdings of wealth. Home values can be affected. Stock ownings can be affected. And these wealth indicia, I think, are important in thinking through how monetary policy works. And finally, the last piece that I want to introduce to you is that expectations are important. Expectations are important in the conduct of monetary policy because if people have a lot of optimism, they're going to act a certain way in a certain economy. If people are highly pessimistic, firms are not going to want to hire. People are not going to feel empowered about the chances of being able to work. So in essence, there is a role that expectations and optimism and pessimism play. And if you think about income inequality and wealth inequality, if those indicia become too wide, you could also see expectations hardening to such an extent that people lose their sense of being able to participate in a mobile society where their incomes, their well-being, their wealth can improve in the future.
Mm-hmm. So from the government world to the private sector, to the company world, Laurent Freitz, we had a film made by OECD at the beginning of this session. Do you usually agree with the way this debate is presented by institutions, public institutions, by political groups, or even by the media? Though I don't invite you to media bashing, but you may have some criticism as the way at the way the different terms of the debate are presented. Do you see things differently from where you are?
Yeah, I think it's important to put things in perspective. Mm-hmm. And one of the major divides we have seen in the past is the divide between North and South, between developed and developing economies, and we have to recognize that in the last 10 years, the emerging economies have really catched up and really emerged. And when we look at the big numbers in a country like China, for instance, that has gone with a movement towards urbanization, we see that the growth in the urban population has increased by 40%. And what we see today is that the number of people covered by a basic medical insurance has been multiplied by 10 in the same period of time. So just to put the things in perspective. Now it's clear that people are left behind, and if we look at emerging economies, we see that we still have 1 billion people suffering from malnutrition. At the same time, we got 1.5 billion people overweight and obese in developed markets. That's interesting comparison. We see that we got 2 billion people suffering from micronutrient deficiencies, which is impairing their mental and physical development, and they have difficulties to access the world of work. So that's one dimension. We see that 2.6 billion people on the planet live in areas where they don't have access to sanitized water. So that's for emerging markets. Now, if we look at developed markets, and I fully agree with what has been said, the major divide is between unemployed people and employed people. And it's not only being excluded from the working society, this is being excluded from the society. And what we have seen in Europe since the start of the crisis is an increase by 50% of the unemployed people. That's a striking number. And if we look at youth unemployment, and I fully concur, that's a massive challenge for our societies. The increase has been massive. It's above 20%. And if you see countries like Spain or Greece, it's 50%. In the range of 50%. That's absolutely unsustainable.
Today, Greece reached an average unemployment rate of 25%, and among youth, it's more than 50%. Yes.
And I think those are the real challenges. We could talk as well about pensioners and elderly people. We know that in the world, Western world, those are the wealthy people, generally speaking. If we look at Central Eastern Europe, those are the people left behind. And they are generally supported by the young generation. And we know that with a debt crisis, with an aging population, the entire system is at risk. So, yes, many groups of people are at risk going forward.
Thank you very much. I see already questions coming in, but so we're moving forward now with Danuta Hübner. This crisis Laurent Freix just talked about, and that has been present in all the discussion so far, is taking a really heavy toll on the population, the austerity measures and so on. Do you think our European social model is threatened? Do you think it can be, because you talked about unemployed people, obviously the way you are the way you live being unemployed is different in America and in most European countries, and this is of course a major difference between us. Do you think we can preserve this model, even if we overcome the crisis?
Before I respond to your question, I would also like to say that it's very interesting because for us Europeans, when we listen to our American friends, when they focus mostly on monetary policy and fiscal policy, we immediately also enter into structural policy in such a case. We think what we can do for the labor market. We think how we can improve access of people to labor markets. So we are, when we think in terms of crisis, unemployment, and how to reduce inequalities, we would always have this in the back of the head, also our capacity to act in the more structural type of policies. And also, if I can say on the inequalities, because in Europe, and this takes me to the social model, because in Europe, that was also, I think, when we were listening to what was said before, in Europe we have huge differences between the north of Europe and Nordic countries and the south of Europe in terms of inequalities. And the north of Europe traditionally is identified as a place where you have rather generous social policy and a welfare state with a long tradition. And at the same time, the Nordic countries are number one on the global list of the most innovative economies. So you have Sweden, Finland, or Denmark with very generous welfare state, with smaller disparities in terms of income, much smaller than in Greece, Spain, or Portugal, or Italy. And at the same time, economies maintaining growth during the crisis and also investing a lot in knowledge, innovation, and being very competitive. So it doesn't mean that social model, general social model must, by definition, mean really low capacity to grow or mean costs to the budget that make the budget unsustainable. So that's just to remember that you have examples of, in Europe also, of this type of situation. Secondly, I would say that there are people who would question that there is a European social model. They would say we have at least two, this Anglo-Saxon model and the continental model, or people would differentiate also north-south and east-west. In the East, in Central and Eastern Europe, we are very reluctant to accept a more general social model. We think we should be competitive and very liberal in whatever we are doing in our economic, but more like UK than probably France or Germany even. But now on this social model, because I think there are some aspects of what we could call European social model, and you could just recently could feel that much of our social model, in fact, has been debt-driven. If you think of the retirement system or pension system, there was a lot of debt in Europe recently due to the reforms to postpone the retirement age. And in France in particular, we had all sorts of also reaction, social reaction to this. In Poland, we just made the decision a couple of months ago, and it was the most difficult decision after transition, I think, to extend the time you work. Why? Because exactly it is too costly. It turned out that with demographic changes, we cannot continue with this system, which is resourced by intergenerational solidarity. And that's why we have to have at least, or we have to have reforms, like in many countries already. In my home country, we've been through the reforms, introducing also not only state-supported system, but also the capital element into this system. And we have also to think whether we don't retire too early, as we are much more healthy. We must remember that when Bismarck invented this system, pay-as-you-go system in the 19th century, it was for people who lived probably 3-4 years after the retirement. Now we live at least 20 years on average after retirement. So this part of the social model of Europe is not working anymore, and we have to think how we can make it sustainable. And it is not against anybody. It is in terms of thinking in terms of responsibility for people who will retire in a couple of years from now and later. But of course, it's very difficult to change the social model, but I think it's absolutely clear today that we cannot go on with the debt-driven social model, that we first of all need growth, and that we need a social model that would be conducive to growth. And that's why we are focusing now very strongly on further reforms of the single market to improve mobility. I think there was a question about mobility. I think mobility of labor, of students, within internal market is absolutely crucial. In Germany, you have huge demand for a lot of people that do not have job and will not have job in Spain in the years to come. But we are not really yet done with the single market. We need also have policies that would improve the access of people, more equal access to the labor market, which means education, which means also more investment in general in human capital, also in professional training. This is not happening in Europe on a sort of daily basis across Europe. We also have to think about further reforms that would improve the capacity of people, no matter where they live or no matter where they work in European territory, in the most remote parts of it, that they can participate in, for example, in all European policies, education programs, exchange of young people, that they can benefit also from what will improve their capacity to enter the labor market. So I think that for the future European social model, we must be much more active in providing people with the instruments to find job, or even to change the philosophy among young people. Normally young people, I talk a lot in Spain to young people, and they are looking for job. And I go to Poland and I talk to young people, and they are thinking how to create a job for themselves. So this is also a mental, different approach to the existing situation. So Europe needs this kind of waking up and this kind of change, which is cultural change, mental change, and become more active in taking also in your hands your capacity, building your capacity to find job or to create a job. So I think that many issues which are seen as a social responsibility of the state or social responsibility of Europe, we have to look anew without any doubt, because it is simple to say, I mean, if we don't have growth, our social model is gone completely. So if we want to maintain it, and I think it's our ambition, we have it in the treaty that we are a social market economy. So there's no doubt that we have to have a huge, deep reform in the social model. And the last thing is that normally when we think of the well-being, of the welfare, of the equalities or inequalities, we think in terms of salaries or taxes, we look at all the things. I think today people start looking differently. I think today people look at the quality of life. Unfortunately, because of the banks during the crisis, we all again started to think in terms of salaries, because we discovered that some people just have very high salaries. But I hope it will be gone soon, and we will really focus on what is the quality of our life and the quality of our life. For quality of our life, we need a completely different approach. We have to have more options to choose. We have to have freedom to choose how we want to spend our life and what is precious for us as individuals also in the social model, and have the chance to pick up what is important for us. So I think we are in a period when the European social model is going to move through a strong evolution, and I think that the crisis is an opportunity to make us think anew of what we have and what we should have. So I hope that we will not waste this opportunity that the crisis has created. Yeah. But without any doubt, we need just more of Europe. That's my conclusion. Because within single market, I think we can handle it much more efficiently.
But it is interesting, and Anthony Jenkins wants to jump in, I think, but just one remark that as we are wondering whether we can save this social model, some of the emerging countries are going in this direction, but they do have growth. You're right. So China and other countries are building some welfare programs and healthcare. So it's quite interesting. Please, you wanted to
no, I think the
answer.
Really, just comment. More to agree, because I think the fundamental problem that confronts the global economy at this point is growth, and it comes back to your point, a good one, about confidence, where it seems to me that the people that I talk to when I travel around the world, there is no optimism. There's no optimism among individuals, there's no optimism among business, and there's certainly no optimism among governments. And without optimism, there's no investment. And without investment, there is no growth. And without growth, frankly, we can't address any of these problems. Because at the end of the day, if the pie is this big, then we're fighting about how we slice up the pie. We can slice up the pie better. We can, get better at education, but it's all got to be paid for. We can, extend the time which people retire, but that will be helpful, but it's working around the edges. The fundamental way to address these issues is to recatalyze growth. And if you look at what's happening in the global economy right now, growth is actually slowing, even in the developing world. And some would argue that in China, growth is slowing to a point which could be unsustainable in the Chinese context. So we have to be very, very careful about how we rekindle growth in the global economy. There is no obvious answer. We pulled all the tricks out of the fiscal and monetary policy bag, and we keep doing that, and that's good. Some would argue that actually if we hadn't done that, we'd be in a lot worse state than we are today. But until we get growth going, it's going to be very difficult to address a lot of these issues.
Laurent Freix, there we have, in the past couple of days here, there's been a lot of talk also about GDP not being necessarily the right tool to measure growth, and I guess this also affects the inequality situation. What do you think of this? Do you think we should consider other indexes, other factors, without going directly to the happiness index, which may be a little bit difficult, except in Bhutan, but we cannot all be Bhutanese. What is your view about this?
No, I can only agree that we need economic growth. The world needs economic growth. Without wealth creation, it's difficult or impossible to fight inequalities and create opportunities for the new generations. Now, and maybe one comment also on that and the consumer sentiment. It is very, very interesting to see that if you look at sentiment in the countries, you look at the 10 most pessimistic countries in the world, you would find 8 Europeans. So we should ask that question to the Greeks, the Portuguese, if economic growth is good or bad. And you would find Hungary, Greece, Portugal, Spain in the top 10, plus Japan, which is suffering also from economic growth, plus South Korea. If you look at the 10 most optimistic countries, and even if emerging economies are slowing down, you would find 8 Asian, plus Brazil, plus Australia. That's the reality. So economic growth is important. Now, is it the alpha and the omega? Possibly not. The quality of the growth is important, and I like very much, and I'm also a true convinced European, I like very much the way Europe is envisioning the growth. And I like very much the EU 2020 ambition of a smart, green, and inclusive growth. So we need the growth, but we need it smart, green, and inclusive.
Very good. Danuta Hubner, you wanted to react to this before we take
I don't want to enter into the
from
happiness index, even though it's quite attractive when you read it. But I think a kind of, I don't know how to call it, but the set of new indicators, I think that in which we would take into account the access of people to education, to credit, I would also say today, and to internet, I would say today. So a lot of things which, in fact, create also now new exclusions. I mean, young people who do not have access to the fast internet today are socially excluded, and they will not have access to labor market in the future as their colleagues from more advanced parts of Europe have. So I think we have also, I mean, people don't care about GDP, no? They can care about how much they can buy with their salary this month compared to the previous months, but they certainly care about all those accesses to labor market, to education, to training, to credit, internet, and so on and so forth. So I think it's very important that we just have this dialogue on this, because it's not just to tell people you shouldn't care about your salary because it's not important. What matters is something different. I wouldn't like to be the person who would say it to anybody. So we have to care about the certain fairness in also remuneration of people's effort. That's absolutely clear. But we also have to invest and here I see the role for the European Union through the 2020 strategy, through those three objectives that we have put on the as flagship for the strategy. I think Europe can do a lot in all those areas that I just mentioned, including the access to credit, because you mentioned growth, but in Greece, yesterday I had a minister in my commission from Greece, and he told us that banks continue to be empty shells there, and so from where the credit can come and how the SMEs can start thriving, and if SMEs do not grow, there is nobody who can create job. And that's why the growth within austerity framework will never happen, I think, and that's a long theme to discuss.
But I do think that this problem is not going to be solved by governments alone, so we cannot put the burden of this upon governments. Governments serve at the pleasure of their citizens, and indeed the whole edifice of the economy rests on the citizens. So business has to do its part as well.
Yeah, so that's a few questions from the audience on this. So please,
we've seen quite a lot of them come in, and a few questions about the banking system and so on. And your point about credit is a good one. But in my view, businesses, whether they're banks or other businesses, have to recognize that they have a social responsibility. They have to be socially useful. It's fair to say that aspects of the banking system in the past, and probably still today, would not pass that test. Now, it's not wrong that people seek to undertake to hedge various different exposures that they have through derivatives. That's not bad. That's a sensible decision for big companies to do that. But excessive trading in derivatives is not good for the global economy. So I think it's incumbent upon every element of society, whether you're a central bank, whether you're part of the government, whether you're in business, whether you're in civil society, to contemplate how we can begin to tackle these problems through a series of programs that aim to upskill youth in particular, so that they can be productive members of a very different type of economy to the one that we lived in 30 years ago. That in itself will be catalytic. SMEs, you mentioned SMEs. I completely agree. SMEs are a huge driver of economic growth. Last week, we launched a big initiative to get SMEs in the UK exporting. In Africa, we run programs with Care and Plan International to help very poor people in villages in places like Uganda create micro-enterprises, which then create unemployment. And we've had some fantastic successes with that, where people have been able to send their children to university as a result of those sorts of programs. So there are things that can be done. And I respect, of course, the role of government in this, but I think it would be irresponsible of business not to step up and do its part, whether it's provision of credit, support of SMEs, providing training for young people and apprenticeships and so on.
But Sarah Bloom, talking about what the business sector can do you see in America? Can you see the private and the public sector working hand in hand, for instance, to fight inequality?
Certainly, and there has been really a number of efforts underway in which the public sector partners with the private sector, in essence, to bring about, to kind of leverage private sector dollars into public sector benefits, and it is really something that I think we understand how to do, and we do quite effectively. More specifically, the sort of this distinction that we're making between, between growth, well-being, and, our kind of what might seem to the audience as a fixation on GDP. This is the measure that we have right now. It is not a perfect measure, but by far, and it is. There's a lot of room for improvement. It is the measure, though, that is currently the measure that it has been used consistently, and it's a proxy. It's but a proxy for well-being, and I think that though it needs to be enhanced. With perspectives. And I think good policy making obviously looks at GDP, looks how it's changing, looks at how it's moving around, but enhances that with perception, with real life experience. I think policymakers should bring to the table a perspective that might show some of the flaws in the measure and show some of the shortcomings and ask, I think we have to always ask ourselves, now wait a minute, why our model might be predicting this, but this isn't happening. What could be happening? What are the flaws in our measurement system? And I think that kind of robust discussion is critical for policymakers to engage in policy correctly.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're arriving towards the end of this session. I'm not sure we have solved everything, but we have touched at real issues. And I would like to ask, before we conclude, to ask each of you, what would you like to take from the audience to take from this session? If there was one thought, one piece of advice, one dream maybe, that you would like people to take away, what would it be? So I will start with you, Anthony Jenkins.
So I think the dream has to be that everybody is able to fulfill their potential, however we choose to define that. That's got to be what life's about, and we're clearly a long way from that, and we face many challenges in the world. So my closing thought would be every institution, whether it's in business, in government, in civil society, has to contemplate what they can add to that journey and then do something about it, because it's one thing to identify all the problems, but then you have to act.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Danuta Hubner.
I would like to leave with, because I see we are dominating, we women are dominating in this room. I would like to leave a piece of responsibility with the women here, because I think, you know, that we were affected more by the crisis, and I think it can be proved statistically. But I think we have also higher survival skills. Don't ask me why. But I think it will be the women that will really drive the change in organizing this post-crisis society that we will one day get. Because I think women are more community-oriented, they are greener, and they are more inclusive in what they are doing. They generate also much more easily alliances across generations also, and across even different professions, I would say, and different groups of people. And I think women are more equality-oriented. And that's why I would like you to be just ready, like Janusz Bujak said to this young lady from Egypt, just prepare yourself to be prime minister one day. So I think I would also like to ask you to be prepared to take over one day and to organize this post-crisis new society on the basis of all the values which I think you represent also yourself.
Danuta Hubner is referring to a story I told her just before we came here, which is... can you hear me? Yeah. Which was in a forum about world democracy a few days ago in Strasbourg. There was a very articulate and strong young Egyptian activist who is one of the first who called for demonstrations on Tahrir Square last year. And a gentleman came to see her at the end of the panel, in his early 60s, I would say, probably, and told her with an Eastern accent, Eastern European accent, now you have to prepare yourself. You have to become prime minister. You have to get ready. It's your turn now. You have to get going. And I looked at his name, and that was Zbigniew Bujak, who was one of the leaders of underground Solidarność in the 80s. So it was quite interesting to see him, you know, asking this young lady to take over. Sarah Bloom-Russin, what is your closing advice or dream?
Oh, thank you. You know, I would say that for leaders who are in the public sector or in the private sector, as you confront the challenges that your economies and your societies are presenting, use your perspective. Use the perspective, your experiences, your insights, bring them forward in the policy debate. They are relevant and they need to be heard. They need to be articulated because they are invariably meaningful, necessary, and they make for better decisions.
Thank you. Laurent Freix?
Yeah, the business can contribute to a virtuous circle of innovating, investing, and creating jobs, but a business can go beyond in embedding in its business models the concept of creating shared value. Mm-hmm. And this is what we have embraced and what we do believe is a great way to make corporate social responsibility sustainable when it's embedded in the business model. So what we have done is to look at the areas where our activities intersect best with society and community, and we have identified nutrition, water, and rural development. And I do believe that the business can go beyond just innovating, investing, creating jobs, and has to embrace the concept of creating shared value.
Thank you very much. Well, I think if we get the implementation of all these ideas and recommendations which have been put forward in this debate, we will definitely do better. So thank you very much for your suggestion. Okay. I thought we were taking questions through the Assembly, but I haven't asked you whether you had questions yourself directly, orally. Does anybody want to put a question to the panel? There's one up there. Okay, so we'll take this question there. Sorry about that.
Thank you. I want to talk about a particular inequity in the current growth. You say that GDP has gone down, but a very large amount of the productive, reproductive and service work has simply gone home. The elder care, the child care, the preparation of meals, the laundry, a very large amount of what was part of market exchange in Europe, in the US and anywhere else has not stopped being done. It's just become invisible and done again by unpaid women. And I would have thought that that might be an inequity that the GDP focus had made very apparent. And the value of this work is inestimable. And as I say, because women are doing it now invisibly, all of a sudden it's not counted and it's of no effect. And it is missing now from the strategic policy paradigm.
So do you have a question? Yeah.
I guess my question is, when those who are exercising themselves so much about the current growth patterns, why this doesn't enter part of the deliberation or part of your considerations, because it's a very large part of the economy.
Mm-hmm. Does any of you want to address this?
Sure. I think it's really an excellent illustration of some of the measurement issues that we are talking about and struggling with, because there are huge swaths. Now, we don't know how much, right, because it's very hard to measure, but there are swaths of the population that are engaged in very productive work that could very well not be captured in the metrics. And that is, I think, just goes to the point of how important it is to make sure these issues and these pockets of work and productivity and sort of real hardship are actually being incorporated. So yes, I think it's very important to know about those.
Can I just also add to this, because in Poland we have for 4 years ago, I think we have established a new social movement, which is called Congress of Women, and we meet annually. 6,000 this year, 9,000 nearly people applied for the meeting. We couldn't accommodate them all, but this is one of the discussions within also the context of further investment in what we call gender macroeconomics, which is also a new part of the economy. And there are various issues discussed in this context. Also, the idea, for example, of having part of the pension that is attributed finally to the person who works in the family, which is usually the man, that part of this pension is also belonging to the woman. So in case of separation or divorce or whatever, the woman can take also part of the pension. So there are many ideas that go in this direction, special bonuses that you can use either to hire somebody to take care of all those things that you mentioned. So there is, I think, movement in trying to find the best solution to finally make this work at home somehow, to convert it into a work which is recognized as creating a value added, which should be paid. So you are not, you're not starting from scratch. You can be sure the crisis clearly had made it more serious, but we have also more and more women in the context of the crisis that give up the job because they have to take care not only of the kids, because the lady that was coming is too expensive, but also of the elderly, of the parents. So she's doing the triple job. So this is part of the discussion. So you are, I can't say that our generation will get it done, but this is an issue well known in Europe, I think.
Thank you. Laurent Freix.
Yeah, I would like to make a comment on social cohesion and solidarity, because I do believe that we need more of this in the current times, and you're absolutely right with what you have been describing. This is also what I referred to when I commented on pensioners and elderly people in Central Eastern Europe, which are supported by the younger generation, and we see the reverse in Western Europe when the elderly are supporting the younger generation. And I think if we see a stable situation in the southern part of Europe, it is to a large extent because there is social cohesion and solidarity among the families to support the youngsters. But I would like to extend that, because I know that we are in a context where inside Europe and globally, but also inside Europe, where sometimes Northern Europeans are blaming Southern Europeans, Western blaming Eastern, and the reverse. I think we should really value very much the values of Europe. Europe has brought peace to the continent. We should not forget that, as brought prosperity. Solidarity is a key component of that. We should make sure that we don't lose and we don't miss that concept, which is so central to the idea and to the development of our societies in Europe. This is solidarity between countries, between regions, between generations, and so on and so forth. I think this is absolutely critical to our future.
Well, Anthony Jenkins, you've been on both sides of the Atlantic. You've lived in New York for a long time, I think, before going back to London. So what do you think of what Laurent Freix just said about this idea of Europe?
Well, I think one of the things we haven't talked a lot about in this debate is the notion of culture and different nations' culture and where nations come from. And the example of Scandinavia is often quoted, but people will also say the Scandinavians who transport themselves to the US exhibit many of the same characteristics, and it's a bit to do with, it's a factor, it's not the only factor, it's a factor in this debate. But I'd just like to say one thing, because we've touched on an issue tangentially in this conversation, which is, in my view, the next really serious tsunami of challenge for the global economy, and that is the aging population. We are absolutely just seeing the leading edge of this issue now. It manifests itself in the way that the questioner posed it, and the economic consequences of that are not reflected, as was correctly identified today, but actually it is very, very much just the leading edge of this challenge.
And not only here, but also in countries
globally,
like China.
Not only good news, everybody's going to live longer. Bad news, the gap between working, I think you made the point, working and retirement has extended too far. That needs to be brought back in. But also the healthcare consequences of this are just astronomical. And this is another area where we really have to get our heads around it. And actually, to your point, there is no superior model, in my view, whether it's the sort of provide for yourself, more individualistic US model or the more socially driven model in Europe. Neither of them are dealing with this problem, as you can see with all the stresses and strains on welfare budgets in Europe and the healthcare debate in the US. So this is about fundamentally shifting, I think, our perspective on what it really means to retire and how much of the wealth that you create in your life you need to allocate for the time when you're not working. And that is going to be very, very challenging, I think, and risks, which is where the question started, risks exacerbating all the problems that we face today in terms of the uneven impact of this trend on women in particular.
Please, Danuta.
Just a few words, because of course, as we are living longer, we will work longer, and let's hope that we will have the pension systems and coping with all that. But also, living longer means also new opportunities for the health service, for all those. I mean, what elderly people to live in good health, what they need or work longer. But also for businesses, I don't know how you see it, but you will end up having a grandfather and a granddaughter working in the same room, and one extremely skillful in all sorts of new instruments, and you will have also to cope with this new culture of kind of working relations as well. well. So it is quite a challenge which can be converted also into opportunity, hopefully, for Europe, not only into a new burden.
Well, actually, there was a panel on China this morning where this was also presented as, I mean, this huge challenge of the aging population in China, and as the population in China is huge, the challenge is also huge. And this was presented as an opportunity for European businesses, because this will, of course, increase the needs in China for this kind of services, and it will be a big market opening to those businesses also. Well, thank you very, very much. I think for this second conclusion of this debate, thank you very much. I will ask you to, unless there are more questions, I didn't see any, but I don't want to miss any. I will ask you to remain in your seats, because we are going to move immediately to the next plenary session, which is CEO Champions, the Power of Business Coalitions for Moving the Needle, which is very much in the continuation of what we have discussed. So please remain seated. Thank you very much.